I'm Sue Stockdale and welcome to the Access to Inspiration podcast. We are on a social mission to encourage you to reflect on the world differently and be inspired by people who may be unlike you. And I'm excited today that we have another of our guest-hosted episodes, where I get to take a back seat and introduce one of the people we have already featured on the podcast to be the host. Today it's Josh Wasserman, who was our guest on episode 44, when he was talking about the role of observation in design. And today he's interviewing somebody that inspires him. Welcome back to the podcast, Josh.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back, and I'm really excited to be able to interview someone who's part of an organisation that has actually inspired me for years. This is Andrew Freear from the Rural Studio, and I will leave it up to him to explain a bit more about what the Rural Studio is and does. But first of all, I don't think Andrew actually knows this. I discovered the studio actually over 10 years ago when I was traveling across the US, and it was from a tip-off from a local artist who I think you'll know, called Butch Anthony. And after a wonderful stay with Butch, he suggested that I go and visit the Rural Studio. So off I went, and I arrived at the point where he said I would find it, and I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. And I looked around and I asked around, and I didn't get a lot of help, but I persevered, and my curiosity and my nosiness finally got me to some structures. So it wasn't a formal introduction by any means. I was inspired by what I saw, and since then I've continued to be inspired by the studio's response to the community in which it was founded. And I'd like to talk to you more, to hear more about what your philosophies are, what the aim of the studio is. And so maybe to start off with, Andrew, you could introduce yourself and explain what Rural Studio is. Where is it, and what does it aim to achieve?
Okay, well, thank you both. I'm honoured to be here talking to you all. I'm a Yorkshireman, born and bred for my sins. And 23 years ago, I was asked to participate in this programme. As you said, it's called Auburn University Rural Studio. It's a programme at Auburn University, and it's part of the School of Architecture. And it was established 30 years ago next year by a couple of professors, Samuel Mockbee and D.K. Ruth. And fundamentally, it tries to get students out of the kind of academic ivory tower and get them to engage with real people. We're here to educate architecture students and help them get a good design education. And the things that we've managed to do in Hale County are kind of, I hope, quite lovely byproducts of that work. So unlike a normal architectural education here, basically 30 years ago, these two professors decided that they'd take a group of students to a kind of underserviced part of West Alabama and see if it could help with quote unquote real projects. And it started out very much under the kind of welfare radar, helping folks who weren't being helped by the social services and providing housing. There's a number of design build programs around the world, but in this case, architecture students get to not only design their projects, but they get to build their projects. And so you essentially were using the students' designs and their energy to support this local community. I was in London and Chicago before this. And so to go from sort of very urban to very rural, I hate the suburbs. So Auburn University itself is actually 3 hours east of here and very, very suburban. And so to come out here, it's rural. We're on the western edge of the civil rights triangle, as I call it. We're about 45 minutes west of Selma. So Selma, Montgomery, Birmingham. And 15 minutes to the east is Marion, Alabama, where Coretta Scott King was born. So this place was very much one of the foundation roots of the civil rights movement out here. It's still there, and we sort of live with that every day. But the rural roots of the movement were very much in a place like this. And I think this particular program, because it's been here for 30 years, we've become really embedded. I hope we've become trusted as a neighbour. It's one of those things where there are programs like this, but they tend to sort of helicopter in. So they might go somewhere else in the world and build a clinic or build some housing, but then they leave. And the difference here is that we essentially have gone into the backyard of the university. We live here. I live here, my staff live here, the teachers live here, the students live here, and we've stayed in one place. And I think we've got to know local municipalities, the local politicians, and I think they've simply seen us as a resource. We started out doing houses, and 10 years in, they started to realize that we could do other things. So we started out with parks, small chapels, churches, and I've worked with all sorts of organisations from the county hospital to Boys and Girls Clubs, built town halls, fire stations, variety of different things, and really just been kind of opportunistic and never at any point said, no, we can't do that, and always tried to figure out a way to do it. I think we wouldn't be doing the work out here if somebody else was doing it. So yeah, I think from an educational point of view, it ups the ante for an architecture student. Instead of having a conversation with a professor across the desk and he suggests you change it to be quote unquote more rigorous, the rigor here is that I'm going to end up building it. I am going to end up building it, and I want to make sure it doesn't leak and that it's beautiful, right? So that's really the aspiration. And we're an undergraduate program, so we have typically about 12 fifth-year architecture students, and they're basically here to do a project. So they can be here anything from 9 months to 2 or 3 years. You can't really build a town hall or a fire station in 9 months. And so we spend about 9 months getting to a point where we can start building. So we rely on those folks volunteering at the end of their time to do the project that is at hand, and we voluntarily support them to do that. So it's a kind of a social agreement between us and the students and the community. So you engage with the community through a project, like Newburn Library, for example, started. The 5 ladies came to me and were bulldogging this idea of a library because there's little kind of after school programs around here and no broadband internet. And they said, we want to get broadband into the centre of town. We want to offer after school programs to the kids. And so that was 3 years in the fermentation process. And then 2013, we were able to hand it to a student team who gave the design and the building some legs. So we converted the old Bank of Newburn into a beautiful little library that I think people are blown away by. So yeah, the rigor is that we're going to live in this. Somebody's going to use this. So it ups the ante in terms of the game that is played. It's not game anymore, it's real. And the other challenge is that typically the fifth years are working in teams of 4. So what you see on the website is projects that are built by teams of 4, and they really grow up because they run meetings with clients, they run meetings with consultants, they're running the project, they're running the budget, they're raising money. Newburn Firehouse, they helped the community raise $100,000 in materials donations for the project. So they become very entrepreneurial, but it's a nice way to engage with the community when you've got a joint project to go for. But all the projects come from within the community. It's not us saying you need a library. It's the folks in the community coming to us and saying, how can we work together to make this library happen? So currently we have a library board that has 4 teachers on it, high school teachers. And so they're the ones that are really tuned into what's the best way for us to help. So we give legs to ideas basically locally.
I thought that was fascinating and brilliant, actually. So my work as a designer and a design researcher, my experiences of design research is that it's really immersion and immersing yourself in the setting and in the culture and in the society of the people that I'm designing with is by far the most impactful technique. However, the difference is with you is that you're doing it day in and day out.
You're really never not at work, I suppose. The feedback, it's amazing. I mean, we've done over 200 projects in about a 20-mile radius. Are scattered. It's not particularly obvious, but maybe some of the designs are obvious when you see them. But the feedback loop's remarkable. Of course, if you do great, you don't hear anything about it. But if you screw up, you definitely hear about it. But from an architect's point of view, as a teacher, to have this kind of catalogue of buildings, at the beginning of every year, we go choose some and we just walk around them and the gloves come off. Because it's like you can tell where you did okay, and the building projects are only a very small part of it. Supporting the organizations financially, culturally, emotionally, that's the biggest challenge in a place like this. It's not just the initiators of the organizations or the initiators of the project, but it's sort of second and third generation that are important, because the first ones, they get worn out by starting it and instigating it, but then who takes it on after that, particularly in voluntary organisations like the Newburn Library. So we've been really lucky with the Newburn Library. They were very clever and smart. They started out with a very clear academic and reading goals and reading, teaching, bringing resources into the community. And now it's been successful enough that they're able to modify the scope of their ambition and say, we really want to be a centre of the community, be a community centre. And you can do that over time when you start to get buy-in from people as well. But it's always tricky, the transitions from groups that do well. And so it's a sine curve. It goes up and down. Sometimes it's doing great. Sometimes it's not doing not so good. And the scarcity of resources out here is really tough. It just drives me crazy that somebody could drop the $25,000 that it costs to run this little community library just like that. And all the time, these ladies are scuttling around trying to raise grant money and this, that, and other to help the place survive. And there's enough wealth in a country like this that somebody could write that check very easily forever. And maybe they will one day. But yeah, the longevity, the sustainability of organizations is in lots of respects much more difficult than the architecture. The architecture and the building is the easy part. And we don't want to just kind of build it and they will come. You've really got to try to help make sure those organizations have got their act together and they know what they're getting themselves into.
Resources is an area I definitely want to talk to you about. I hadn't considered the financial side of it. I suppose I was more thinking the material side of it, because that's something that I witnessed when I was visiting, was that there was this amazing use of perhaps would-be waste materials, and I found that absolutely fascinating. But maybe before we get into that, and this is quite a big question, I guess, but how has Rural Studio changed from its inception in 1993 to when Samuel Mockbee and DK Ruth co-founded the studio to today?
Yeah, I hope it's kind of moved with the times. Right at the very beginning, it was really a place that scavenged materials, and it got well known, for good or for bad, for recycling lots of different and strange looking materials. And I think the truth of the matter is that between 6 and 10 years in, when I showed up and we started to be asked to do community projects, the truth of the matter is that at that point, if you're looking to help sustain a community organisation, you can't be building things that are built out of materials that you're not clear of what their longevity will be, right? So there's a responsibility there to make sure that you're building something that will be here a long time, but also that the locals can maintain. And that, I think, we started to learn the hard way from that. So we asked ourselves, can we bring the delight and the invention by simply using wood? We're right slap bang in the breadbasket of the timber industry of the United States. It's the most sustainable way to build locally and renewable and screws the planet up the least. And so shouldn't we be building out of wood instead of kind of strange and wacky looking things? And if you do that, people can also fix it themselves rather than building it out of something that's necessarily strange. So I think in some respects it was responsibility. It was really, in our view, more sustainable. In the late 90s, we built a house out of carpet tiles amazing house out of carpet tiles for Lucy Harris. That's remarkable. And it's these stacked carpet tiles that has incredible insulation value and really good thermally. But it's also in an area that gets lots of tornadoes come through there. And every time they come through, I'm like crossing my fingers, because if that thing gets hit, they're not going to be able to fix that themselves. And so there's some responsibility that we take. You've got to be careful of the thing that you help people with, right? We've learned the hard way through that. There was lots of invention and creativity, but the restrictions are actually better sometimes. And that's where it really asks you to be creative and inventive. So we very much moved towards wood, and I think it's really honestly just been a responsibility that we, instead of it being what can we do, it's like more today, it's what should we do. I mean, we've been here 30 years. We've got a legacy of projects. We can't be the maintenance man on all of those projects. And we want people to take ownership of a house or a home or a building and be able to fix it themselves. And there's lots of other ways to be creative instead of with strange materials. So I would argue is where the studio has gone. In about 2003, with our house projects, we were doing a single house for a single family. And the house was always about a particular family. and frankly quite idiosyncratic. And at that moment, I started to get frustrated that there wasn't a building of knowledge. And right at that time, the landscape was transitioning from shacks into trailer homes. And these trailer homes, they're financed like an automobile, and they last about as long as an automobile. So people are getting ripped off with these things. So I'm not saying they're neither better nor worse than a shack. In some respects, they're worse than a shack because at least the shack will fall into the ground and disappear. The trailer, they're built with questionable materials, their dimensions so that they can be taken down the road. So we said, could we come up with an affordable home that anyone and everybody could afford? At that time, we put the price tag of $20,000 on it because that was about $100 a month in rent or in mortgage. And we've been working on that ever since. And every year we build one or two of these houses as prototypes. And 4 years ago, we established a thing called the Front Porch Initiative, which is now actually building these houses all across the southeast. And we've got 12 different partners that are building these homes. So for me, it's incredible that we can test something here. We can give it to one of our neighbours. We can see how well it works. The next year, we can change it a little bit. And now we've got half a dozen of these models that our Front Porch Initiative is actually working with organizations from Nashville to New Orleans building these things. So for me, it's like that's kind of goosebumps that a little tin pot little organization in the middle of nowhere can actually have that kind of impact. And that was because Fannie Mae, who basically manages the mortgages for the United States, they have a kind of mortgage product for rural condition, but no prototypical housing. And we're like, okay. And it was odd for us that they would come to us that we're the only game in town that's doing rural housing. This seems outrageous. So I think we've started, because we've been in one place, it's not only the place, but it's also kind of rural issues, systemic rural issues, whether it's insecurity of food, housing. Housing's number one. We've always been a housing-based organization. We believe that good housing is a basic human right, frankly. We're working with an organization trying to figure out how to deal with wastewater, because the ground around here doesn't perk very well, so you end up with sewage sitting on the surface. Access to housing, loans. There's a myriad of really complicated issues that are out there. Air property, who owns property. I mean, it's so complicated that we've had to say, I think as the Rural Studio, needs to be a voice for the rural and say what these issues are. And I think that's because we've been here for 30 years. That's given us legitimacy from that point of view. My pitch is in some respects that the rural condition in a place like the United States has been really treated like as a colony. I mean, this is an extraction landscape. Things are taken from here and very little is given back. And that is such a short term towards this place. The breadbasket for cities. So if you look at the demographic maps of the United States, the Black Belt, the Colonias, the Mississippi Delta, all extraction, little given back. And guess where all the poverty is? Right in those places. It's no accident. It's all been by design. And it's a shame that it couldn't be understood as being a little bit more symbiotic. I mean, there's 70 million people living in the rural condition that's remained at 70 million for the last 120 years. So rural isn't dying. It's just city has gone up through the roof. The urban condition has gone through the roof, but they're still taking from these places. So, and I think it's short-sighted. I mean, there's many issues with the world. I don't know that this is the biggest issue, but maybe it leads to the political situation that we've got, that there's a lot of people feel that they're disenfranchised. So, I mean, locally, I can tell you that they don't really think it makes much difference whether the Republicans or the Democrats are in charge in Washington, because Washington feels so far away. And that's tough in a country that is this big. But generally, folks here would like decent internet and good healthcare and decent housing, all the things that you want in cities. It's not that much of a mystery. My internet, my house, I have this dashboard the internet provider gives me, and it proudly states that my internet service is 1,140% slower than the national average. Whoop-de-doo. Isn't that great? I think the pandemic proved that if you have good connectivity, you can live in these places, and people actually were interested in living in these places, and there's great creativity and vitality. And I think the other thing that I always wonder is, like, why, Josh, from your point of view, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day and sort of wondering why there's sort of a lack of imagination for the rural condition. And particularly from a design point of view, it's like, why is design considered like an urban thing? It can't be for rural. Why is that? Is that just a kind of subconscious thing? We like to think that we bring young folks into a place like this and they bring energy and it breaks down some boundaries, class boundaries, race boundaries, misconceptions about this place. And that, I think, is a good thing. The world is full of these bubbles at the moment. So the news is what I want and what I want to be fed, and it's all from the people that I agree with. And here, I agree with most of my neighbours, but we have to get on, we have to communicate. And that, I think that's a good thing. It feels like I'm not in a bubble, although the Royal Studio is kind of a liberal bubble, of course. We all want to save the world and do good and all of that. But it is interesting for me to come to be from here and how sort of little is known about the rural condition. 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited to go to Harvard to do a fellowship. And it seemed like I was invited as the kind of the rural guy. It was like, what's that?
This is great. And I've got too many questions to cover in the time that we've got. But everyone's ideas that I'm trying to get my head around. And one of them is, I'm sitting here thinking, do architectural studios work like that here? Do they work like that in London? And I don't know the answers to that. And I don't think I probably quite have the right question, but it's around growth and where you were situated, and you've still got a low population, and that belt across the states has essentially been maintained, as you said, the same population for a very long period of time. And as a designer, to answer a little bit about your question before, a lot of my work comes from cities, especially hyper-growth cities and fast-developing countries around the world, because I think this is where money grows. There's more people, money, taxation. And if Rural Studio's goal is not to enable first growth, then what happens if suddenly your community does start growing rapidly? Can you still support it? And how does that change? And if not, then what are these core values that you feel you can bring to a community, whether it grows or not?
Well, I think we would probably fundamentally say that people and place really matter. That's what matters most in the world, I think. One of the things that's happened with the kind of the industrialization of agriculture and the industrialization of food production is our little towns are now scattered and dotted with fast food restaurants. So they've lost a lot of their identity, because a lot of identity is brought through food and the way that it's served and presented. When we go to Italy, we like going to Italy because we go to a different town and the food's different in the town. And it's because it's grown around the town, and that's incredibly culturally rich. And I think there was much more of that here 100 years ago or 50 years ago, and that's been lost. I don't know that anybody can do anything about that, but I think recognizing it is important. I don't think our work would end if people started to come and live here. I do hope that as an organization, we can open the eyes of people to the kind of the richness of a place like this and to respect it. We have ambitious students who want to save the world, and you can't come to a place like this and tell people how to live their lives. Can't be patronizing. So I think our attitude here is a kind of slow burn, small victories. So we're supporting the local institutions and respecting the character and the people of the place. When I go to a lot of community meetings around here, there's always talk about bringing industry in. I think these places could simply build on the quality of life that they have without necessarily having to have industry come in and change the tax base. I think it's sort of recognizing what is inherently good about a particular place. We have an incredible local hospital here that is totally bucking the trend of rural hospitals. And it's nothing to do with the Rural Studio, it's nothing to do with that. It's got an administrator who cares deeply about the hospital and the services that they can provide, and has really tried to understand what role that they can have in a local community. They're the second largest employer in the county, so it's hugely important. And they've tailored their offerings, particularly in things like physical therapy, to be able to compete with institutions in Tuscaloosa or in Birmingham, where people would drive here to a place 50 miles or 90 miles away. And you can say, look, Their mantra is neighbours helping neighbours. You can come here, you know the person that's going to help you. Let's offer you comfort and help through that. Their messaging is dead. They're more than surviving. I think they're thriving. So your question's a tough one. I think we're trying to support the essence of the place. The implications of growth is good. Is kind of growth can be bad. Our capitalist society means that we're always trying to push the prices down. If I get a lot of people moving in here, guess what's going to happen? Land prices will go up, house prices will go up, and then we lose the people that we're trying to work with. And so it changes the community drastically. And it's an odd thing, and I think I can say this. It's like our school system has a terrible reputation. And I think that's stopping a lot of folks coming and living here just because it has a bad reputation. I don't agree with the reputation whatsoever, because my daughter was in there and I thought it was fantastic. But it has meant, I think, that we haven't had people coming in and changing the demographic drastically. And actually, I think that's a good thing, because I lived in Chicago in the mid-90s, and I lived in neighborhoods where it was like a swarm of locusts came through. The locals were moved out. Buildings came down, changed very quickly. For me, in a place like this, what's really valuable and beautiful is a kind of collective memory that you have in local structures. We've worked really hard on this library to change it from being a much loved little physically white building that was the old town bank that everybody loved. And I think when they heard Rural Studio was going to have at it, like, oh, I don't want anything strange going on there. But we respected that, and people absolutely adore what we've made, but the sense of the original building is there. And that's really important, and that you value the institutional, the collective memory, but also the physical manifestation. The first instinct here is not to demolish something and get rid of it. And that's a big deal at any level. The problem with growth and development is I can just come in and we teach that architecture school. Nothing worse than an architecture school that's like, let's go to Mumbai and we're going to develop this area. And we're teaching students it's okay to just that and start again. Great message, right? Talk about colonial. And there's value in all of this. I think people laugh at, we have a building called the Red Barn that's our design studio. That's a rickety old barn. We've actually just been given that building and we've been designing in that building for the last 20 years. And it has an incredible presence in the downtown area. And for me, it would be a travesty to knock that thing down. So we're trying to figure out how to just make it a little bit more comfortable in summer and in winter, but that it retains, it's not from a sentimental point of view, it's from a philosophical point of view. This building is important. The resources that we're putting into this building is important. Why is our gut instinct to just level it and start again? Nah, come on. You can be more inventive than that and creative than that and sustainable, honestly. Our throwaway society is just, oh dear. It's interesting. I see students coming through our program who haven't learnt from their parents how to fix things. So it's becoming more and more difficult to have a hands-on experience because folks don't even know how to change a light bulb, let alone how to swing a hammer. And that is society happy that we're going that way? I don't know. I mean, I don't know about that. I want my kid to be curious and knock that wall down or cut a hole in that wall or fix that plug or fix that light bulb, But the way our societies, and I sound like an old fart, but is that what we want? And I find that a bit frightening, honestly. But it's not the students' fault. It's just culturally, it's like my colleague says, there's no pickup trucks here anymore. Like, well, yeah, right. Students used to come out in pickup trucks. The architects that are visiting this place this semester are not tooting our own horn, but we've got the greatest architects in the US visiting us all the time who are so passionate about their work. They love this place and they like the way that the students are empowered. And the students understand how difficult it is to do something well because it's their problem. They're not just handing it to a contractor or a developer to do it. They have to deal with the implications of the design choices. And that also helps them down the road engage with a contractor and a maker because they've started to do that. The architect today we end up just being napkin sketches. We draw a napkin sketch and we give it to somebody else. And I think that's, again, it's a bit sad. I think we should care about the craft of things. We should care about the way things are put together. And from concept to completion, it's a richer world if it's that way. Those cultures, the Danes and the Swedes, where there's this kind of design is inculcated in society, I think it's really kind of wonderful. I'm always jealous of those places. But I always say everything's designed. I mean, I actually decided I was going to look like this morning, shocking as it might seem, but design is everything.
So following on from that, one thing that really strikes me about what you're doing with Rural Studio is the power it has and your ability to listen. And that's also part of my work as well, to listen and observe. And I think for the benefit of other people listening to this podcast, I suppose any other organisation that works with the community, how can you teach people to be better listeners?
Maybe ego's part of that there's this kind of feeling that you have to do something and you have to be evidence of you doing something. My predecessor, Mockbee, hired me. I told him, I said, I don't really know anything about the South. And I don't know anything about this culture. So all I'm here to do is listen and learn. And a little bit of the problem of our program is that it's called a design build program. And so there's sometimes I always get concerned that the students feel that they've got a God-given right to build something. And building something is not always the answer. And so we've got to be really careful. It's like build it and they will come. And I think sometimes the toughest decisions we've made have been not to do that. I mean, I'm lucky. Ours is a state institution. It's a land grant institution at Auburn University. It's a remarkable idea. The university has an office in every county in the state. So there's 67 counties, I believe, in the state of Alabama, and everyone has an office in it. And they're there to help the locals, and that's their job. And it's like the sad part of it a little bit is it's been undermined by the internet, but there is literally a physical presence of the university in every county. And what an idea that you can bring the kind of resources of a university to help, whether it's through health or farming or education. That as a kind of listening model, I think is superb. You embed people in a place, you have local people employed there, you can talk about real issues, you're not helicoptering folks in. I think to answer your question, often the most difficult problem's right in front of you, and you don't have to go somewhere else. Look in your own backyard and listen. And I think that's honestly all that we've done. In that respect, I think we've furthered the university mission in doing that and kind of up the ante by building things. It's always really difficult. I mean, I look at many programs that go overseas and do things, and I have no idea how you decide to help somebody. It's like, are you really helping? Are you really helping? Someone saw you get off the plane, they came up to you and they said, yeah, I want help. It's like, well, I don't know whether I'm doing more harm than I'm doing good. And we've certainly gone through that process here, and we learned from it. We didn't leave it. And again, I think very often the most difficult problems are right there in front of you in your own backyard. You don't need to go somewhere else. The other thing I try to encourage our students, it's funny when you see photographs of architecture in the world, there's so few of the photographs of architecture with people in them. Well, there certainly used to be. I think there's much more of a fashion today that we've had a photographer, Timothy Hursley, who's this most unassuming, humble guy, has actually followed us for 30 years. And he, right from the beginning, has always photographed people in the homes. And we actually delight in the way that people live in these homes and in these community projects. We're not sort of offended if they do something that, oh my goodness. For me, it's like they've taken ownership of it. I hope we're not sort of snobby about our architecture. The greatest joy we have is if you own it. Paint it pink. It's great. It's all right. Don't worry about it, I think listening, you have to bury the ego somewhat. It's like you don't have to fix every problem and not understand what the problem is, but understand what the real question is. Getting to the right question. That's the deal.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of my biggest hang-ups of being a designer, and certainly this is a symptom of design agencies of the past, is it felt very much like there's something to be made and there's going to be an educated white guy that's going to design it and make it and hand it over and say, this is what you need. And to a degree, I think this is one of the issues with anything that's mass produced, in that there's a lack of ongoing responsibility. I don't think Rural Studio is lacking in that. I think because you live in it, because it's part of your community, people can design and make things that cost a lot of money, going years into production. People buy them, and that's often the end of that relationship. It's very transactional. Looking at from an ecological perspective, that means things aren't designed to be used for a very long period of time. Things aren't designed to be fixed, repaired, upgraded. And this is very late in the game, but I believe that there is a shift that we're going to see and really, really catch on, certainly from this moment. And it appears to me that you're very progressive in that sense.
Yeah, I think the United States is very big, and so it would be difficult to replicate a program, certainly a program of this reach in England or in Italy, just because it's so much denser and the kind of administrative oversight for good reasons is so much more pointed. Here, the kind of the dirty secret of a place like this is there's no money in the local administrations to supervise what building standards that you build to, right? And I think certainly in our early days, I would say the Royal Studio took advantage of that. When we started doing public buildings, and really now in everything that we do, we build to the International Building Code, and we're building better than anybody else out here just because we have professional oversight. All of our consultants that are helping us do these projects, they set the bar, and we're like, yeah, we're a state institution. We've got to do that. This has to be applicable. But the flip side of it is it does allow us to deal with some of those issues more as a social contract. So if there's a particular circumstance where we don't need to build a handrail and the mayor and the local administration are on board with that, let's put the resources not into the handrail but into the ground surface or something. Like that kind of common sense opportunity. That's not about, oh my goodness, if we don't do it, we're going to get sued. It's more, what's the best way to use the resources? That, yes, can be about beauty, but also can be just simply about appropriateness. I was in Norway for a little while, and in Trondheim, they actually had a section of the city where they deliberately were questioning the building regulations and saying, well, let's take a little piece of our city and make it so that these can be questioned, because they can sometimes be a total waste of resources, and not that they're not well-meaning, but that, again, can we do this case by case and actually ask the question? So I think we've been able to do that at Royal Studio, certainly more recently.
I'm wondering, Andrew, if there was one bit of advice you would give to our listeners who may not be in architecture or design, but there are some important principles for life that I think you're sharing with us here, what would be your one bit of wisdom you'd want them to leave with?
One bit of wisdom. We always say to our students, come into this place with your eyes wide open. Try to check the preconceptions at the door. Because you imagine when I tell people I live in Alabama, the immediate conception of this place and its history is so ridiculously stereotypical. It's nothing to do with the way I live my life every day. And I think if you can go into most meetings every day not holding on to your preconceptions about how it's going to go, or even in a conversation like this, because I think it's definitely helped me kind of maneuver this ship. There are things that annoy me that my neighbours might do, but I always try to think the best of them, that they're doing this for a particular reason and that their intentions are good, not that their intentions are bad. And I think check your preconceptions at the door would be a good message, whether you're visiting West Alabama or coming to England post-Brexit.
I think it definitely calls on me to say thank you to Josh for the wonderful interview questions, Josh, and for such a stimulating conversation, Andrew. If people want to find out more about Rural Studio on the internet, how might they go about doing that?
Just ruralstudio.org, Rural Studio, all one word. We have that's in charge of communicating for us on all of those other horrible platforms. So we live in a food desert here. So we built ourselves a kitchen. And then we said, well, can we farm this land? Because we're in a place called the Black Belt, and a lot of that soil has been over-cultivated and washed away. And it was called the Black Belt because of the beautiful black soil, not because there's a bunch of black folks living here. It then was cotton propagated, so it's been poisoned. But now we've built our own farm infrastructure, and every student at the Royal Studio works in the farm. We produce 7,000 pounds of vegetables every year, and we're super proud of it. And we have a farmer who's a biologist, just completely showed up by chance. And he's made it very clear that it's a soil project. This is about caring for the soil. This is not just about the stuff that's coming out of it, but care for the ground, and therefore care for the place, and look around you and understand why there's nothing growing here anymore. But make the soil, make the foundation, the project. So check out the farm, Royal Studio Farm. It's really really amazing. I'm very proud of it.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Josh. I'm sure you could have asked many more questions.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, I could.
Pleasure to meet you both. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Huge thank you, Andrew, and that was very inspiring.
Well, that was the final guest-hosted episode for now. Next time, we are going to add in a short bonus episode where I'll be discussing these episodes with my co-founder Clive Steeper and reflecting on what we've learned from this experience and any themes that we think have emerged from these conversations. I hope you can join us then.